Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Nadell, and I am a professor of history and director of American University's Jewish Studies program. Welcome to the fourth webinar in our fall 2024 series, Anti-Semitism, a Political Tradition. We have already heard from Professor Michael Brenner, director of American University's Meltzer-Schwarzberg Center for Israel Studies, about anti-Semitism in the European context. I discussed anti-Semitism in the American past in our second webinar. Last week, Dr. Julie Korestes, postdoctoral fellow in Holocaust Studies at American University and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, talked about the anti-Semitism of Hitler's photographer. This series this year is co-sponsored by AU's Jewish Studies program and the Meltzer-Schwarzberg Center for Israel Studies. Its 6 talks highlight the work and perspectives of our own faculty and alumni, and we are especially delighted that today we'll be joined by Dr. Lauren Strauss. As always, the faculty of both programs thank the Center for Israel Studies Managing Director, Laura Cutler, for navigating so many of the logistics to make our programs possible. I also want to especially thank Dr. Strauss for coordinating this year's series. We welcome you, our audience around the world. You include friends of the university, of the Jewish Studies program, of the Meltzer-Schwarzberg Center for Israel Studies. Among you today are AU alumni, academic colleagues from many other institutions, and our own students. Now it is my real pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Lauren Strauss is a senior professorial lecturer and director of the undergraduate studies program for AU's Jewish Studies program. A scholar of American Jewish political and cultural history, she teaches a wide range of courses on American Jewish politics, Israel studies, Jewish history, and modern Jewish literature, including a course on Black Jewish relations. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish visual artists, Yiddish culture, and radical politics in interwar New York and the DC Jewish community. She has consulted to museums and has published on these topics. Dr. Strauss, thank you so much for being here today. We all look forward to learning from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nadell. Thank you also to Michael Brenner and the Center for Israel Studies, and to Laura Cutler and to Eric for helping us with our technology. So this series, which is so needed, really at any time, has already as Pam was saying, as Dr. Nadell was saying, in only the first 3 of our lectures, has already shown us the breadth of approaches to discussing anti-Semitism. Much anti-Semitism research, or research on what many scholars are starting to call Jew hatred because of some issues with the term anti-Semitism, has either enumerated the different types of anti-Semitism, a taxonomy, if you will, calling things either political or religious or racial or economic anti-Semitism and the overlap thereof, or scholarship has focused on creating lists and naming and classifying long lists of anti-Semitic events and also tropes or themes over the years. These 2 approaches are extremely important. In order to address the problem, we need both definitions and identifiers, and also evidence-based research of where it's been happening, when, etc. But another aspect of anti-Semitism has been comparatively neglected, not entirely overlooked to be sure, but too rarely examined as an important aspect of Jew hatred around the world. And one reason for this is that even talking about it is delicate, and you'll see why. And it's somewhat controversial to broach because it addresses the acceptance of and even dissemination of these anti-Semitic images and tropes by Jews themselves. as a result of and a function of the critique of Jews in the larger society. And I do want to emphasize that this is where almost all of these originate in the first place. And we'll look at that. But disappointingly and somewhat paradoxically, the flourishing of anti-Jewish images in the Jewish community has also thrived the most, at least in recent decades, in the most seemingly tolerant, or at least we used to think, the most seemingly tolerant environment that Jews have ever encountered, the United States of America. So today I want to begin to address this complex cycle in a few specific areas, mostly to touch on what is a really complicated and extensive body of material that includes such disciplines as history, psychology, political science, gender studies, media studies, and more. I argue that this phenomenon emerges from the depths of anti-Jewish imagery and from the most diabolical theories about Jews, Jewish alienness, and conspiracies, but that it's then these ideas are then absorbed and regurgitated by many Jews, particularly in the arts, if we're looking at modern America, meaning 20th and 21st century America, and then released again by these creators out into the general population via movies, TV shows, cartoons, jokes, etc. And they then metastasize in the general population and distort general perceptions of Jews among people who, unlike perhaps their creators in the Jewish world, people who perhaps don't have any other context for understanding what Jews really are, and then are sort of are just not unintentionally complicit, but are just beset by images without any kind of offsetting ideas or knowledge about Jews. So this becomes a real cycle, really a truly vicious cycle. The word is apt there. And it's a tricky argument to make, though, and one that I hesitated before making today, but I thought that it was really important if we're really talking in this series about as many aspects of anti-Semitism and how to address it as possible. And it's tricky partly because it hints at what has been called in a larger context, victim blaming, right? Even when these ideas don't originate with Jews themselves. And also because it requires a different kind of work, if you will, to be undertaken by the Jewish community themselves. In other words, it requires them not to have the same exact kind of protective vigilance that Jews have had to develop and are still developing in response to anti-Semitic slurs and incidents out in the general public, but it requires a different kind of work. It requires a kind of turning inward to interrogate one's own narrative and one's own community and really try to be honest about what's accurate and what is originating where. In a more positive light, and I try to be an optimist, that ultimately requires a reassessment and an assertiveness and a strengthening of one's identity if one is really going to address and push back against these stereotypes. And that, as I will say later on at the end of the talk today, I think that besides being a silver lining, that's also really one of the only avenues toward fighting back against these images. In developing a strong self-identity and a willingness to look for the truth. Since I can only begin to address this very large thesis in one talk today so far, I want to focus on a particular but very prevalent aspect of this internalized critique of ideas, and that is the image of the Jewish woman, specifically in America, that has been conveyed and perpetrated for many years, certainly for over 100 years. As we shall see, such anti-Semitic ideas as Jews having undesirable or even grotesque physical features, or the idea that Jews are socially undesirable and display garish manners and modes of dress, or are too loud in both behavior and voice, or that Jews are materialistic and that they seek to be manipulative in order to control. All of these larger themes that are part of the kind of pantheon of anti-Semitic images are all applied very specifically to Jewish women, often exponentially more than to Jewish men, at least when those ideas come from the Jewish community itself. These concepts are, as I've said, introduced initially from the non-Jewish world. The idea of wielding power and being manipulative and being physically repulsive, etc. And there are manifold examples of this from the European context, but they're often repurposed and have been by America, often by Jewish men, sometimes by Jewish women, as entertainment or as self-indulgent soliloquies and creations. So despite all that, I want to start out with a, quote, joke, big air quotes there, joke. And the joke is, it's a little story, really. A prince enters a castle and finds a beautiful woman lying on a bed. He tiptoes into her room and he ravishes her. As he leaves, he's approached by the lord of the castle. Lord of the castle says to the prince, "Have you seen my daughter? She's been in a coma since a horse threw her off his back last week." Prince says, "Oh, in a coma? Oh no. I assumed that she was Jewish." Now, what is that saying? That's saying that the woman in question, being presented as a princess, can be a Jew, but only if she's incapable of opening her mouth and speaking, revealing her crass origins. She's wearing the trappings of being a princess. And so I guess that fits in with the stereotype. And most of all, this, of course, alludes to the theme of sexual frigidity that often accompanied a certain genre of jokes that were around in the 1920s, the 1930s, etc., but that really achieved their full prominence in the 1970s and 80s and became known, of course, as the Jap joke, the Jewish American princess joke. Now, in the decades of the end of the 19th century, which we have sort of assigned the name the Gilded Age for various reasons, and it's a very entertaining TV show that was recently on a cable channel, but it also unfortunately describes an era in the latter decades of the 19th century and a little bit in the beginning of the 20th century, when the United States, going through paroxysms of labor versus management fights and an increasingly wide divide between haves and have-nots in society, and the beginnings of very loud nativist objections to immigration and to new immigrants coming in from Europe, most especially about Jews. It evolves into a strikingly anti-Semitic period in Jewish history and American Jewish history. I'm going to share my screen and show you some images. Okay. And all right, there we go. So here we have a Gilded Age image. No, there are no women in this particular cartoon. We'll discuss why that is. But here is a typical, fairly typical image that one might find in the media in that era. And you see already many of the themes, many of the tropes that I'm talking about. And we'll get back to where the Jewish women fit into this. So this is from Sound Money magazine in 1896. And this, I should add, is the height of a financial crisis that had started in 1893 and a fight over the place of, or whether there should be in the United States a gold standard. People may be familiar with the populist leader, politician William Jennings Bryan, and his very famous speech in this same year, 1896, called his Cross of Gold speech, where he thunders against the gold standard and memorably says that the United States will not be crucified upon a cross of gold. It is not coincidental that the Jews involved in the nascent banking industry in the 19th century were seen as being advocates of the gold standard, and that populist leaders saw this as being detrimental to the fortunes of sort of the common person in America. This then became translated into, in their worldview, an attack on Americanness, on the American economy, on principles of sort of a true blue values, Christian values that made America great, dare I say. Here we have then not just any image of a Christological figure, a Christ figure obviously being crucified here, but the Christ figure here is Uncle Sam, is America himself. And if you, the reader of Sound Money magazine, hadn't already figured that out, it's clearly labeled here. This is the US in the hands of the Jews. Then there are some quotes from the New Testament here, a reference to Judas, who is a thinly veiled reference to Jews in general. What Judas, i.e. Jews, should do to themselves is hang themselves. A US dollar here that they want to stay safely away from the gold standard. But the real connection here, the most obvious one besides Judas, is that the people who are in charge of the bloodletting here are Republican and Democratic politicians. This is supposed to be Grover Cleveland. And then these guys on the outside of the crucifixion, and they are Wall Street bankers. But if you can see, their physiognomy is obviously tagging them as Jews, and most especially because of the size of their noses, their bulbous lips, their glasses, heavy facial hair. This guy is rotund and suggesting some kind of opportunistic blood-sucking capitalist. So this is not an atypical image that you would see at the time. Now, at this same time, to sort of bring it back to these issues that are being raised here in the Gilded Age, this, as I mentioned, is a time of heightened immigration of all people from around the world to America, especially in the 40-year period from the early 1880s to the early 1920s, when immigrants were coming from around the world. Fully 10% approximately of all immigrants, approximately 25 million people coming into this country during that era, are European Jews. They are coming not for the usual immigrant reason of making some money, sending it back home, and then going back, but they are coming to stay. They're fleeing dire poverty and persecution, and the vast majority of them go right into the workforce. So we have kind of a contradiction in terms here, right? I was just saying that the anti-Semitic image of the Jew in America is one that looks at them, especially in the 19th century, as a mercenary, powerful, weapon-wielding banker. And yet, the vast majority of Jews in very short order from the turn of the century onward is the working Jew, is the lower class, hardworking, often sweatshop worker, exemplified most famously by Jews on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, but also in other immigrant enclaves as well, whether Chicago or Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore. So how do anti-Semitic ideas then turn and accommodate for the new reality? Well, they essentially use these same tropes that I just showed you in that cartoon: vulgar physicality, loudness, pushiness, materialism, drive to control. And they then apply it even to Jews who are clearly in the underclass economically. So we have here this image of the working girl, the Lower East Side Jewish working girl, and this is in the Jewish Daily Forward in 1927, which is a little bit late for this image, and we see her and her father, and she is, as my mother would say, all verpitzt. She is wearing the latest fashions. She has her little hat on. She is clearly wearing makeup. She has her hair done up in whatever the au courant style is. She's wearing heels. And her father, whatever he's doing, he's clearly a menial laborer. He doesn't look very happy. She is engaged in all of these frivolous pursuits, and he is working his tail off there. But chances are that she also works 12 or even 14-hour days in the garment district. And this image of the so-called ghetto girl, which the scholarship on that is really extensive and was most originated in the work of anthropologist and historian Riv Ellen Prell, who pointed out the twin misogynist and anti-Semitic themes that are present in the characterization of this striver, this would-be social climbing ghetto girl. The clincher here, though, is that, as you see, the image that is being portrayed is done so in Jewish media. So they're absorbing the Jewish media and the powers that be in the public square, in the Jewish public square early in the 20th century, are absorbing these other anti-Semitic critiques and repurposing them in a maybe funny to them, also if you're part of that culture and you know maybe the flip side, the good aspects of the Lower East Side working girl, but that if it's just decontextualized is completely negative. We have here another interesting image that is slightly different, of true ghetto girls in the 19 teens. And this introduces another element then of this drive for power that's not only via money and via mercenary control, but is through politics and activism and being loud. This image, which is from the Lower East Side Tenement Museum collection, is of a Jewish women's political group. I purposely didn't write on the slide what kind of political group because I wanted you to think about it, but of course I can't see you, so I don't know if anyone is guessing. Their political agenda, this group, is that they are advocating for women's right to vote in the United States. They are suffragists. Again, this is not far from the kind of threat that we saw presented in very different ways. One way might be through Jewish bankers. One way might be through the sexual wiles of a striving fashionista, But also threatening is this drive to wield political power and use their voice by these Jewish working girls. They are not, in the Jewish media, held up for the most part as an example for most women in the community to follow. They are seen by the majority, even people in very progressive politics, as troublemakers. This then brings us back to the issue of what it means to present yourself in a way that is acceptable to the majority feeling of what an American should look like and sound like, what an American woman should sound like and look like. And this then brings us back to the most obvious, most prominent, shall we say, element in the early 20th century and really up through the late 20th century, slurs against Jews and in particular Jewish women. And we saw it in the physiognomy of the guys in the cartoon at the beginning. And of course, I am referring to the Jewish nose, and in particular, the female Jewish nose. Now, this happens to be from France in the same era, but if we look at the American media and the American Jewish media, you see many, many references to ugly immigrants, to ethnic characteristics. Jews are compared to other ethnics who do not fit models of expected sort of American beauty, like Italians, Greeks, and others who in that era are not considered white. They are not white. They're not considered white. They're not treated as white. And eventually, they moved toward, in the 1930s, being seen as something called white ethnics, still just unwilling to see their prevailing physical characteristics as acceptable as a true blue American. And they're also compared to African Americans, and put in a certain basket as being undesirable physically. Probably the most famous nose in early 20th century Jewish life and culture belonged to Fanny Brice, the famous entertainer, comedian, singer, actress. Her life, of course, was immortalized by none other than Barbra Streisand in the play and then movie Funny Girl, and then the much worse movie sequel to it, Funny Lady. Fanny Brice, on the one hand, broke barriers in terms of her acceptance as a popular entertainer, but she did so not very far into her career. In 1923, by bending to the criticism, the constant criticism of her face, and especially her nose and her hair, by having what was the first widely discussed rhinoplasty or nose job. And she permitted photographers in the room as she was having her procedure, her rhinoplasty. And Dorothy Parker, the humorist, famously quipped that Fanny Brice, who some said was never as funny after her nose job, Parker quipped, Fanny Brice cut off her nose to spite her race instead of to spite her face. There were mixed feelings about what this said to America and to this drive to fit into a paradigm of Anglo-Saxon beauty, but that was not really achievable by most certainly Ashkenazi American Jews, or for women of Italian background, Greek background, and other, as I said, so-called ethnics. Jewish men were also caricatured for their noses, as we've seen, but their obstacles were more financial and social, and had obstacles in realms like business and education and quotas of getting to schools, etc. That was more the lot of Jewish men, as opposed to Jewish women, who were judged on the basis of their appearance, their voice, their general demeanor, the extent of restraint that they exhibited in advocating or not advocating for their positions in society and in politics. It was usually through popular culture that many American Jewish entertainers, both in the 19 teens and 20s, and through the middle of the century and well into the 21st century, dealt with these barriers very publicly by, on the one hand, unfortunately, themselves employing racial stereotypes of various immigrant groups, and most infamously, notoriously, using blackface to show that they were not part of a group that had become sort of the bottom of the heap in terms of social acceptance in this country. But on the other hand, they are using humor to reveal the hypocrisy and the lack of character of the groups, the reigning groups in power. Joke lines and later routines on stages of the Borscht Belt, in the Catskills, mostly patronized by Jews, maintained a precarious mix of humor that simultaneously tried to affect this balance, pillorying the ruling WASPs, as they call them, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but at the same time as they are criticizing the so-called materialistic Jewish girls, their suffocating Jewish mothers, and a variety of ethnic types. So these entertainers are exemplifying what we now know was an uneasy attempt to define themselves as worthy, as American, genuinely American, and at the same time to assert their right to critique the country that they now called home. This uneasy balance would take a much more sinister turn in the middle of the century. In the late 1940s and 1950s, with the advent of blatantly anti-communist governmental committees, most famously HUAC, House Un-American Affairs Committee, and rhetoric in the United States government and the public square, the media and elsewhere, education, etc., and in the film and television industries. Establishmentarian Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League developed educational wings to their organizations that were meant to show the patriotism and solidly democratic values of American Jews. And this, of course, is now 20 years after the gates of immigration to this country close, in exactly 100 years ago with the Johnson-Reed bill that effectively barred almost all Jewish immigration and that of many others. And it is after World War II when Jews saw the peril of, as they perceived it, living in Europe and not living in America. They were very, very eager to be seen with the advent of the Cold War as being on the correct side, the American side, the loyal side, because they didn't want there to be any hint that they could ever be sent back to Europe, as in fact some Jewish radicals had been with deportations in the 19 teens and early 20s. The historian Stuart Svanken, in his excellent book about this era, he reports that these committees and these establishment Jewish organizations like the AJ Committee and ADL were really, in the words of one of their own board members, Jewish front organizations that showed indicated the lack of comfort that American Jews had with the idea that they were of I'm sorry, with the extent of revealing the efforts that they were making to fit in. In other words, they created different titles for these committees so that people in the world at large, for instance, were viewing a television commercial or a documentary that showed what good citizens Jews were, wouldn't realize that this had actually been written and funded by the American Jewish Committee, because this was so it was so revelatory about their sense of unease at this particular juncture in time at the height of the Cold War. The most dramatic moment in this, to put it mildly, era of discomfort came, of course, with the arrest of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg on charges of spying for the Soviet Union. They were arrested in 1950, in the summer of 1950, and after many, many appeals and a ton of press, they were executed in the summer of 1953. Now, Ethel Rosenberg, who I want to focus on not only as an ideologue, as someone who may or may not have known about the spy ring to which her husband belonged, but again, as a Jewish woman, she in particular was pilloried for those same sort of physical and character drawbacks that I was mentioning before, that the ghetto girls and that the suffragettes and others were criticized for as well. So it wasn't enough to be accused or suspected, along with American Jews at large, of potentially being a fifth column, a disloyal subgroup subverting the good American values. But on top of it, she was a Jewish woman who many people felt embodied all of the unattractive qualities and, frankly, unfeminine and unnatural qualities that they had feared. I purposely looked and found this photo of her, by the way, because I've seen many photos of Ethel Rosenberg, and almost all of them are after her arrest or, are show her in moments of exigency and sadness. And this shows her as a happy young woman. She was not cast in that light, though. She was attacked much more in these respects than her husband, who was the more active member of the accused communist ring, for being unattractive, messy, a bad mother, neglecting her children, for being dark, European, foreign, and on and on. This is her mugshot. This is the photo that really circulates in most of America throughout the media, including in anything circulated by establishment Jewish organizations, which were very, very quick to distance themselves from these tropes, from these ideas that a potential spy, which she really wasn't, we can get into that later, that a potential spy is also a Jewish mother and a Jewish woman and a Jewish wife. As is well known, the prosecuting attorneys and the judge who sentenced the Rosenbergs to death are Jews. Roy Cohn plays an outsized role in this, but it's not really necessarily the major characters, but it's all of these auxiliary organizations and media coverages that cement in the American mind, coming often from the American Jewish community, the fact that this unfeminine female is not to be associated with good American Jews, with good actors. She would be one of several examples of Jewish women being portrayed throughout the century as a political menace. From earlier on, Emma Goldman through Ethel Rosenberg, and later on the 1970s, people like Elizabeth Holtzman and Betty Friedan, who were all portrayed as unfeminine, emasculating, dangerous. Popular culture continued to be one of the main forums for disseminating these ideas and putting these anti-Jewish slurs about physicality, materialism, or dreams of power and manipulation that had originated in non-Jewish contexts back into the non-Jewish mainstream. Just mentioning, because we don't have time to go into them at length, the sort of the men best known for creating some of the most enduring images. I of course have to mention Philip Roth and his pretty much his entire milieu of women that he created. His most famously Portnoy's Complaint, Jewish Mother, and his Jewish American princess, Brenda Potemkin from Short Hills, New Jersey, and who, by the way, had a nose job, which she told her lover in Goodbye Columbus, made her go from pretty to prettier. So Philip Roth, Herman Wouk, creator of Marjorie Morningstar, Woody Allen, and many others. The pretty girl is vapid versus the hardworking, hard-living girls that you wouldn't want to necessarily bring home. The late 1960s civil rights movement involved a large number of Jews. Some historians estimate as high as 2/3 of the non-Black activists in the movement were Jewish. These are, of course, among the most famous, as well as other activists in radical and progressive politics and causes, from anti-war activists like the Weather Underground to birth control activists, and others were largely people always like to use the word disproportionately Jews, and many of them were Jewish women. But both Jews and women, Jewish and non-Jewish women, were told increasingly as time went on, for complex political reasons in the civil rights movement, that they needed to stand back and be useful, but let others take leadership positions. This was, of course, a great disappointment to them. But in retrospect, I posit, and others do as well, that there were several important points that the Jewish activists, and in particular the women, learned from their involvement with some of these radical groups, and in particular the civil rights movement, and especially the Black Power aspects of the civil rights movement. One of these, discussed as often not discussed as often as some other points that they learned from their involvement with the movement, is greater comfort with their ethnic selves. The idea that Black is beautiful began slowly to translate for some, not all, young Jews into Jewish is beautiful. We begin to have a dichotomy in the Jewish community, especially the youth community, between the people who are trying to emulate, again, still Anglo-Saxon ideals of physical beauty and demure behavior, versus those who perhaps are not altering their faces, or I should say straightening their hair. And by the end of the 1970s, you have this really prominent sort of push and pull between people, not only in the Jewish community, but very visibly in the Jewish community and some other ethnic groups, between the allure of sort of doing what it takes to fit in and look like everyone else, versus being yourself and perhaps being taken more seriously, but by extension being out there more and being criticized, often with anti-Semitic and increasingly violent imagery and threats against those who refused to fit in to the realm of the larger popular culture. At the end of the 1970s and into the 80s, the Jewish girls and women who were refusing to alter their faces, most famously Barbara, though she does straighten her hair here, were losing out. And again, where are they losing? They're losing in the realm of popular culture jokes and imagery that is coming largely from their own community. And this significantly is translated into a nickname, a slur that co-opts a racist term from an earlier era for a different group that is suffering from exclusion in America, physical exclusion, as we know, of course, Japanese Americans, and the term Jap is repurposed, made into an acronym for Jewish American Princess, and that is then used as not only a slur, but a cudgel to wield to threaten Jewish women, especially young Jewish women who dare to be loud, to assert themselves, etc. I have to end on an optimistic note because that is who I am. In the fall of 1987, the Jewish feminist magazine Lilith, which is still published today, printed a sort of groundbreaking issue, as they often have, where they blew open this myth of not only the Jap and Jap jokes, but the connection between so-called Jap jokes and violence, specifically on college campuses. They did not stint to connect the creation of this myth to the Jewish community itself, and often to Jewish men in this community, but they also pointed out what it really was and what it remains today. Although it's not, the term Jap has not entirely been retired, but has been replaced. They pointed out that it was, of course, anti-Semitism. It was Jew hatred. It was also misogyny. And it was also not even thinly veiled threats out in the open, jokes about strangling Japs, for instance. But whereas we have seen tropes, anti-Asian women tropes, anti-Black women tropes that go off in other directions, the ones that describe Jewish women are drawing on, to come full circle, are drawing on those same images, those same anti-Semitic ideas of materialism, manipulative, would-be power, ugliness, grotesqueness, the idea of imitating but never really being of a certain culture, of a majority culture, the idea of conspiracy and undermining the integrity of real Americans or the true society. We come full circle to what in America was so prevalent in the late 19th century, but as my colleagues have shown, they actually go back centuries. The optimistic part of this, of course, is not only that we now have multiple platforms, Lilith being one of the first in print, multiple platforms created by American Jews themselves and often by American Jewish women, but other ways that American Jews have started, not fully enough yet, but have started to reassert themselves as people who are proud of their ethnicity and also as Americans. And they have, especially in the past year, come forward as people who are reassessing their right to be outspoken in a political context, to organize, to create organizations and media platforms, and yes, to stand up and say out loud, to coin a phrase, that they are Jewish and proud. They do this in the face of sometimes unremitting hate, especially on social media. But I think that the Jewish community, from my perspective, especially in America, has started, at first timidly, but not timidly anymore, to take that first step into self-ownership, not hiding behind another facade anymore, and hopefully being able to not be creators and disseminators of these ideas anymore, but be part of the solution, pushing back against them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I really, as I think about your title, Walking a Tightrope, tackling the subject is walking a tightrope, but it's really essential. It's so important. And we actually have many questions. And let me encourage you, if you haven't posted one yet, to please add them to the chat. We have a little bit of time left for questions that I want to start is one of the questions asked about, would you define this as internalizing oppression? That what's happened within the Jewish community is that they have accepted these stereotypes, and especially in the United States, and that they've internalized oppression.
Yeah, it's interesting that the vocabulary that is often used in other contexts in America, and especially on campus, I think, has for some reason not been employed as much by the American Jewish community. So I think, yes, whoever asked that, yes, I think that's exactly what it is. It is internalizing oppression, but American Jews and certainly others aren't going to do it if the Jews don't identify it themselves, first. Uh, Whether or not it's their job, that's the reality. That if the Jews don't name it, then nobody else is going to. This vocabulary, whether it's internalizing oppression or another frequent one, being erased. You hear those a lot to describe the experience of other groups that are oppressed, but for some reason, American Jews, I think, have a problem with directing those at their own experience, even though it very much is that.
So Nikenje Friday, one of our senior administrators, takes this a step further, and she asks, so how do we update our definitions or even expand them as we think about terms like oppression?
Well, I'm happy that Nikenje Friday and I have already been talking about this, and of course talking about hair. As one does. I think that a good first step, or certainly one of the first steps, is to allow Jews to be to bring themselves, or to be brought back into, I want to say into the fold, because it's not a fold that anybody wants to be a part of, but to recognize that slurs, anti-Semitic slurs, ideas, processes of excluding Jews, ostracizing Jews, refusing to speak to Jews on campus and elsewhere, that has to stop, and that hate speech against Jews has to be seen as hate speech, and not as another animal. And for various reasons, political, but also social reasons, some of which have been, I think, perpetrated by the Jewish community themselves. the Jews have been loath, I think, to, especially in America, to see themselves as a group that could possibly be persecuted in America. Again, I think this last year has changed that to some degree. But also, ironically or paradoxically, because of anti-Semitism and other forces, groups that need to address these problems in their own experience have often been loath to include Jews in discussions about the solutions.
So it's interesting because you're talking about both Jews perpetrating stereotypes that others have developed, and then also responding in some ways to the stereotypes. And one of the questions that we've gotten is about that most ethnic groups, maybe we should also talk about immigrant groups, but ethnic groups in the United States have had anxieties over their acceptance as Americans and were subject to racist and ethnic slurs, including negative images and jokes like you've described. And this questioner wonders, is anything distinguishing the Jewish community's response from the way other groups respond? And I know you're not expert on other groups, but it's interesting to think about, is the Jewish response in some way different?
I think that it's different, mostly in its timing. I think that I know that Jewish, for instance, Jewish comedians, and Jews were among the founders really of stand-up comedy, and many of much of American comedy in the 20th century, were among the first in a particular group, whether racial or ethnic group, to discuss openly the fact of what people today call their othering, and to stand up and talk about what made them different from other people in America. I don't think that is unusual, certainly anymore. And I think that now you hear that from Asian comedians and Muslim comedians and all sorts of groups that you didn't hear from those groups in those contexts, certainly in popular culture, in quite the same way or with such regularity in certainly the early and the middle of the 20th century. And one of the reasons for that, as I mentioned, I made an oblique reference to the Borscht Belt, to the Catskills, was that there were certain forums that were very strong in the Jewish community, the creation of certain spaces that encouraged popular culture, often live entertainment, that sort of gave rise to these routines. Two other areas that encouraged those kinds of discussions were Broadway, were musical theater, where Jews, especially in the golden age of Broadway, were sort of these insider outsiders, as I always call them, and often setting up straw men or proxies, really, for someone who they thought of as the Jewish character, but was the other, the alien in the production, but who they didn't feel quite comfortable enough yet in the 40s and 50s to make actually a Jewish character. So they did it through those proxy means, and also, of course, through the birth of television as a popular medium, and the impact of the Jewish creators, especially behind the camera, and the writers in television and movies.
This is such a rich topic, certainly one that I know you explore in your classes. We have so many more questions, including I see one from one of my students, but unfortunately I'm going to encourage people to continue to think about these things, and especially to continue to read and also view on the subject. We could actually probably talk about popular television at the moment. That would give us more information. Let me encourage our audience next week. Natalie Japkovich, who is chair of American University's Comp Sci program, computer science program, is involved in a major project tracking anti-Semitic hate on the web. And she will be our speaker next Monday at 4 o'clock. We hope we will see all of you then. Please join me in thanking Dr. Lauren Strauss for a wonderful talk and contribution to our
Thank
series.
you, Pam. And I just want to add, anyone who has questions, feel free to email me. And I'm happy to talk to you about it. Thank you again, Pam.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.